For the better part of 500 years, the Roman Empire ruled the Western world, conquering nearly all of the surrounding area around the Mediterranean and most of the Middle East. And they accomplished that goal by having a very formidable army. And anyone who would dare to not simply surrender to them or cause an uprising, they would simply squash with their military might. But in order to get to certain places in the empire, in order to mobilize their military, the roads that they used needed to be straight and flat. Because any time there was an uprising on the outskirts of the empire, they would almost immediately have to send in troops, and the longer they waited, the more time it took them to get there, the more the uprising would begin to bubble out. I remember visiting the Middle East one time, and they were showing us the ruins of an old city, an old Greek city that the Romans had conquered. And they said immediately upon conquering a city, in order to create an avenue through the cities so their armies wouldn't get clogged, like nowadays we have highways that go from city to city. And nowadays you have bypasses. For example, anyone who's been on the 294 around Chicago knows that you go 50 miles out of your way probably to get around the city to avoid traffic downtown. But the Romans did not build bypasses. When they conquered a city, they simply took two main roads, one going north and south, one going east and west, to allow their armies to flow through the city. And so if your building, your home, your business happened to be in the path of one of those streets going straight through the city, either north or south or east or west, they simply leveled it. This is eminent domain on steroids, right? They just leveled it. And they did that for a good purpose, because if they were going to keep peace in the empire, they needed to be able to mobilize their enemies or their armies to get out and squash or quell any rebellions that were going on in their territory. What the people in the first century would have heard by John the Baptist in the desert crying out, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths," they would have remembered two things. The first thing is the prophecy in Isaiah that we heard from in our first reading today. In the desert, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the wasteland a highway for our God. Every valley shall be filled, every mountain and hill shall be made low, the rugged land shall be made plain, the rough country a broad valley, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed. They would have heard that prophecy from Isaiah as John the Baptist is crying out in the wilderness. They also would have remembered, of course, the Roman roads, under whose occupation they happened to be in the first century. But for God, that meant something very specific. In the second week of Advent, as we're preparing for the coming of the Messiah, we have to remember what the coming of Jesus to the world is all about. It's about reconciliation. It's about reconciliation. God being reconciled with humanity. God, who is perfect, being reconciled with his imperfect and often rebellious creatures. I see that call, that analogy of the Roman Empire in wanting to send its armies to the borders of its territory as a spiritual analogy for the importance of forgiveness in our lives, in many different facets and many different areas. It's not for the purpose of the expansion of an empire, as the Romans had it, but for the purpose of the expansion of our hearts. As we approach Christmas, I think we're being proposed today to consider what it really means to have peace in our lives. Not peace as the absence of war. There's been about 30 years of peace in the world. I think somebody did a study. In 4,000 years, there was 30 years of maybe peace in the world. But God came to give us the reconciling love that reconciles us and lets us know that we have a kingdom not of this world but of heaven. The second candle that we light, I don't know if you knew this or not, but every candle has a word associated with it on the Advent candle. I don't remember what they all are. The pink one is joy. The first one, I believe, is peace. The second one is peace, light, and something else. This week, the principal at our school, Mrs. Fuller, decided to quiz the children on what the second candle stood for. And I happened to be in the classroom with the 8th graders, and they said, "Oh, we got Father. We're going to have the answer right away." She has all the teachers email the answer. And she said, "What does the second candle of the Advent wreath represent?" And they said, "Father, what is it?" I said, "I don't know." Light? I know that's one of them. I can't remember if that's the first or the third. No, it's not the third, because that's joy. And so they said light. Well, the answer was peace. Appropriate for our readings today. So, friends, the question before us today on the second weekend of Advent, if there is a mountain in our lives right now before Christmas, a mountain that needs to be leveled because we need to ask somebody for forgiveness, maybe the Lord is asking us to level that mountain. If there's an area in our lives where we need to give somebody forgiveness, perhaps it's time to fill in that valley. If there's a shame from a past sin that we're so still engrossed in, if we haven't confessed it, confess it. If you have and it's still daunting you, let it go. But if there's something like that in your life that's making the path crooked, maybe it's time you ask the Lord this Christmas 2017 to straighten it out. Maybe it's something that you need to be forgiven for, forgiven from, need to forget. Friends, I always tell people and remind them the importance of remembering that God is much more interested in your future than in the past. And today, as we hear John the Baptist crying out in the desert, "Make straight the way of the Lord, prepare his path," the source of power in our lives does not come from the Roman Empire, as it was in the past. The source of Rome, the source of real authority, always comes from God. Always comes from God. And I know it oftentimes comes up, especially in this area of forgiveness, as we think to ourselves, "Father, but if you knew what happened to me, you would understand why I cannot forgive." And you're right. But does he not understand? Make straight the way of the Lord. Prepare his paths. And have the most peaceful Christmas this year you've ever had.